This is a killing ground. It's absolutely been set up as a dead-end killing ground.
There's even the argument that Hitler has this nostalgic, well, in the forest, we're going to do better.
Yeah.
Because look how we beat the Romans.
And it becomes the symbol, as you say, of German nationalism. All sorts of operas and novels are written around it.
If they had pushed east into Germany Magna, would they have then gone for Britain?
Britain was always likely, and Britain does prove eventually to be fairly prosperous, but it requires a disproportionate garrison for a long time.
It's the year 9 AD, and the Roman Emperor Augustus is looking to further expand his ever-growing empire. His forces had already made significant inroads into Germania, but this was all about to come crashing down in a forest to the east of the River Rhine, Teutoburg. Over the course of 3 days, the Roman legions found themselves trapped in the unfamiliar terrain, before succumbing to a military defeat so emphatic that only a handful of men were able to escape. It was a massacre that was not just one of Rome's greatest defeats, but to add insult to injury, the Germanic victory was all orchestrated by a former Roman cavalry commander. I'm James Hanson. This is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, a humiliating defeat for Rome and one which effectively stopped further expansion into Germania. What might history have looked like if the Romans had won here? That's a question for our experts, and joining me, as always, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And for the first time on the channel, we're delighted to be joined by the ancient historian and novelist, Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy. Welcome to you both. Okay, now in front of us here, we have a map of the Roman Empire and its expansion under the Emperor Augustus. Now, a few things to note, first of all. You have Germania Magna here, and you have Teutoburg, where the battle that we'll be talking about takes place. You've got the existing Germania provinces, the Roman provinces of the time, Germania Inferior and Germania Superior, and this here is modern-day Cologne, just to give you a sense of your bearings. And of course, on the west of Germany, you have the Rhine River, and then to the east of Germany, you have the Elbe River. You've got the Balkans down here, you've got Rome, of course, the imperial capital, and then one thing to note at this point in the year 9 AD, the Roman conquest of Britain has not taken place. Dr. Chris Parry, to start with you, set the scene for us in terms of Rome's influence and relationship with Germania Magna at this time. I mentioned it's in control of 2 provinces, but you know, there's a load of tribes in Germania. What are the relations like at the moment between the Roman Empire and these Germanic tribes?
So these 2 provinces of Germania Inferior and Germania Superior are really extensions of the conquest of Gaul. And the Romans have set themselves up really here to stabilise the tribes that exist there, to Romanise it, obviously build Cologne, Colonia Agrippina, and also Mainz as well in Germania Superior. The problem they've got is that there's a huge demographic pressure from the rest of Germany, and they're subjected to raids across the border. There's a famous one in 16 BC, where a whole Roman legion and a half is completely surrounded and massacred. It's called the Clades Lolliana. And so they're really worried about stabilising the frontier. They also want to get trade going and tax whatever they can here. So what we've seen before is Caesar has 2 expeditions across the Rhine, just as he had 2 expeditions to Britain, obviously during his time. And just about the time of 11 BC, Augustus's stepson, Drusus, starts leading a number of campaigns that essentially are raids in strength to stabilise the tribes that are here. We'll use their names later, but they're typically the Cherusci and also the Marsi and the Marcomanni. These are huge tribes, probably about 50 tribes in all. They come together occasionally, but most of the time they're fighting each other. So what they're trying to do, the Romans, is divide and stabilise this so you don't get these raids across the border, and also you get this active frontier that they're able to trade and tax. Now, under Drusus, there are a number of campaigns, and also there's a very large incursion that occurs by the Romans, basically nearly 65 to 70,000 in 6 AD under a chap called, two chaps called Saturninus and Lepidus. And they have a huge raid in here to try and stabilize these tribes. The problem then occurs is the Romans have a revolt in Illyricum. And of those 13 legions, 8 are taken away. And by the time of the Varan revolt in 9 AD, there are only 5 legions left, 3 of which are the field force and 2 of which are essentially garrison force. And at the time of the revolt, 2 of the legions are in winter quarters. And as we tell the story, we'll see that the main field force of 3 legions, the 17th, 18th and 19th legions, one of which had been commanded by Varus in the past, are actually engaged in a stabilization mission amongst the Cherusci. Now, the Cherusci are right at the heart of this revolt because under Drusus, a noble called Arminius, aged 10, had been captured, had been taken to Rome, and basically they tried to turn him. And they gave him all the benefits of a Roman education. He became a Roman knight. He actually commanded Roman forces as a cavalry commander, and he is a trusted quisling in many ways. And they trust him. And he's part of this force. And the conspiracy that he puts together takes place after the 8 legions are detached to go for the Illyricum revolt, and there's only 5 left on the frontier here. So the Romans are quite weak in terms of defending the frontier and indeed going beyond the frontier and going in to settle these tribes.
Well, Adrian, let's bring you in on Arminius's ploy. And by the way, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here on History Undone. So you've got these 2 key figures we'll talk about a lot. You've got Varus and you've got Arminius. And Varus sort of trusts Arminius at this point. He sees him as quite a loyal member of the Cherusci tribe. He sees him as kind of a friend. So what does Arminius say to Varus to convince him to come into the Teutoburg Forest?
Well, first of all, he tells him about a rebellion in the Far East, which has pulled Varus and the sort of the field force, really, that he's put together of what troops he's got left that haven't been sent away to the Balkans, to deal with a problem. And it's the knee-jerk reaction of any Roman governor when they hear about rebellion is gather whatever troops you can, rush to the heart of it, knock some heads together, make a demonstration of force, and hopefully it would all fall apart. You will just overawe them by your supreme self-confidence. So he goes and does that, but that pulls him further away from where he wants to be. You know, as Chris mentioned, 2 of his legions are already in winter quarters, where you have come to the time of year when you don't campaign and you really need to be out and settle down somewhere where you can be supplied for throughout the winter months, when it's hard, particularly in a province like this that's hasn't got the infrastructure of somewhere like Gaul. You know, there's not such a big population, there's not so much agricultural produce that you can use to feed your men. So Arminius pulls him away, but again, he's doing what a loyal person who's joined the state, joined the empire should do. He's reporting problems, threats, insurrection, and off Varus goes to deal with it, something he's done before. He's done this in Judea when he was governing Syria in 4 BC, and it mostly works. You terrify people, you put on a show of force, but it puts him that much further away from the Rhineland, which is where he wants to be for the winter, with an army that's not equipped for a long, long campaign. It hasn't got the food and it's burdened down with everybody else who's been in the province over the summer but doesn't want to stay there in the winter when things are a bit dodgy. So traders, families, all of this sort of thing. So he's got a column that's not really suited to active campaigning. But Arminius is assuring him all the time that, well, look, you know, we all like you here. One of the things he's been doing and other German leaders has been, instead of making war on the neighboring tribes when they've got a dispute, which is the normal way of doing things, they've gone to court. They've appealed to the Roman governor to arbitrate in their dispute, which is just what the Romans dream of. That's how a peaceful province should work. You go to court, you fight your battles that way, rather than actually in blood on a battlefield. So Arminius is doing all the things that a good German-turned-Roman should do. And remember, the Roman Empire works because it's gone throughout the world and it's made people Roman. It's the sort of equivalent of the American melting pot, but instead of bringing people to you, you go out and you convince enough of the aristocracy locally that it's much better to join the imperial system and take service. And Arminius he's the poster boy of this. It's absolutely perfect. He's got a brother, Flavus, who's doing the same thing. So everything looks right as far as Varus is concerned when he looks at Arminius.
And Dr. Chris Parry, I mean, Arminius's ploy is get Varus in and then ambush him.
Well, in fact, what happens is that these legions spend the whole of the summer in the land of the Cherusci. So they're obviously amongst the very tribe that Arminius has allegiance to. Meanwhile, Arminius is getting all the other tribes together and saying, look, we need to set a trap here. And what he does is he gets hold of the angry Varii, who are up to the northwest, and said, look, create a bit of trouble. I'll get other tribes like the Bructerii to start raiding the Romans just to provoke them a bit. We'll tell them the angry Varii are the real trouble, and we'll go via there, and then we'll go to the Rhine and go into winter quarters. And the decision is made to go and sort out the angry Varii. Cherusci are going along with it, but of course they've been watching the Romans, corrupting them through the summer, and as Adrian says, basically cutting off their supply lines, making them dependent on them. And essentially Varus says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. We'll deal with this minor tribe and we'll go back for tea and medals in winter quarters.
And Adrian, is there not a bloke called Segestes who essentially warns Varus, listen, don't listen to Arminius. He's not got your best interest at heart.
Yes, but again, the circumstance of this is that Varus is dining with Arminius, with Segestes, with important Germans, important noblemen from the royal families where the tribes have them. And they're all apparently playing the game of thinking, yeah, the Romans are the big friends we really want to have. And then they're all competing for Varus's favor, which again is perfectly normal and expected. So Varus, naively perhaps, but again, hindsight's a wonderful thing, doesn't believe Segestes and says, well, look, so far, Arminius has this spotless record of service to the state and to Augustus. He's sworn an oath. He's done all the things. He's a Roman, for goodness sake. Then why not believe him? I don't see any reason. It's also, of course, it's what Arminius wants to, what Varus wants to believe. He doesn't want to feel that he's facing a really serious problem at this stage so late in the year, and also in a province that isn't where the main action has been, that's been starved of resources for years because the big trouble has been settled by now, but for the last 3 years down in the Balkans in Illyricum. So all the talent, all the reinforcements, all the reserves have gone there, and you're left with a fairly sort of understrength, stretched thin army. You don't want a big problem. You're just hoping. It's much better to believe that there isn't a big problem than it is to start contemplating that possibility. So go along with Arminius. He's been fine up to now.
And
I mean, the Segestes thing is even more interesting. There's a personal issue, of course, because Arminius is actually kidnapped, abducted, and married forcibly Segestes' daughter, and she appears later afterwards. After the battle. So there's all sorts of tensions going on amongst the Germans. So what Arminius has to do is delay the Romans long enough so this coalition comes together so they can actually provide the trap with the angry Varii and everybody else coming together to be able to surround them. As Adrian says, what they're trying to do is catch them on the march in an area of topography which is wooded. You've got a boggy area and all that sort of thing. So they cannot deploy, as you see at the start of Gladiator, if those are familiar with the film. That open space is made for the Romans. If you're a German, you don't want to engage in that sort of space. So what they've set up is a very good topographical trap. And those of you know how deer are trapped. This is exactly how the Germans have set it up. You could put them into a dead end, essentially, and we'll look at the battle in a minute. But this is like how you trap wild beasts, and you catch them on the march. And to quote another film, if you've seen The Last of the Mohicans, there's an attack in that by the native Indians. If you catch an army on the march and not in formation, then they're uniquely vulnerable because they're so thinly spread.
Well, Chris, Adrian, you've set the scene beautifully. Let's zoom in now and let's focus on the Battle of Teutoburg Forest itself. OK, we've got a brand new map in front of us now showing the battlefield itself. You can see the Romans are denoted here in red and the German tribes in blue. Adrian, to start with you, just tell us a little bit, if you can, about who these German tribes are and also who the Romans are, because there are, 3 Roman legions here?
Yeah, I mean, the Germans they're a warrior society. Men grow up learning to fight. They have status. The acclamation of a leader or a chieftain is to raise him on a shield and clash or spears against your shields to sort of, recognize him as the man who's going to lead you to war. So they fight lots of wars, but they're not professional soldiers. They're a mixture of farmers, herdsmen. Some of the people who are in the sort of the entourage, the hearth troop really of your princes, your kings, are semi-professional. But basically, these are people who have to be told, okay, we're going to fight a war, so this is where we're going to muster. They're not a permanent army. So that's one of the reasons why Arminius has to channel the Romans so he knows where they're going, is because he can then tell everybody, right, be there on this day, we'll be waiting for them. When the Romans attack the Germans, they're nearly always hit on the way back to the Rhine, on the way back to their province, because the Germans can't organize until that point. So it's a very individualistic army, very brave, but it's not, in normal circumstances, very subtle. And that's one of the things that Arminius will bring, because he knows how the Romans do things. And some of the tactics used here are things he's copied directly from how the Romans do things. Now, in contrast, the Romans are a professional army, and Augustus has completed that process that's begun a century or so before of making the Roman army a permanent force. He creates 28 legions. 3 of them are here at the Teutoburg Forest. You've got the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th. Now, most legions end up gaining a title. You've got 2nd Augusta, 14th Gemina, this sort of thing. As far as we know, the 17th, 18th, and 19th don't last long enough to actually get that sort of honorific title. They've probably served in earlier campaigns. Augustus celebrates, he's brought peace to the Roman Empire. You can go to Rome, see the Ara Pacis Augusti, the altar of Augustan peace. But that's peace from civil war. His reign has seen this concerted expansion and consolidation. Lots and lots of foreign wars. There's only 2 years in his reign where there isn't a foreign war going on. So probability is that a lot of these men are fairly experienced. They are people who are serving in the Roman army originally for 16 years and then 4 as a veteran. Augustus has expanded it just 3 years earlier to 25 years altogether. So that probably hasn't pleased a few people. This army here is, you've got the citizen body, which is these 3 legions, should be about 5,000 men under normal circumstances. These ones were significantly under strength by the time they got here, for 2 reasons. One is that that's what always tends to happen to armies once you start actually using them and once they're operating on campaign. Second thing is that the emphasis for recruits and reinforcements has been the Balkans. So you've been the quiet sector for the last few years, which means you haven't got the priority for resources. And then on top of that, Arminius has been telling Varus, well, could you give a garrison to this little community because we've got some problems here, and a few Roman soldiers would reassure everyone that the empire does rule, the empire is strong. So he has deliberately persuaded Varus to draw men away. So we can't estimate their numbers, but you're probably talking more like 10,000 than 15,000. But again, that's a guess. On top of that, you have the non-citizen soldiers, the foreigners, the auxiliaries, as they're called. And we're told that he has 6 cohorts of infantry. Cohort is 1/10 the size of a legion. There are 10 cohorts in a legion. So paper strength, 480, 500-ish. Again, in real life, probably lower. And 3 cavalry regiments, or ally, which are the same sort of size as the cohorts. So again, in theory, you're talking, 4,500 men, probably significantly fewer. But they are professional soldiers. They may not be Romans, but they serve for a long period of time. They're drilled, they're disciplined, they're uniformly equipped. If you remember, each Roman soldier will have a helmet, body armor, shield, and a good sword at his belt, apart from the pilum, the heavy javelin he throws. That's the equivalent of the equipment of a chieftain, of a really wealthy warrior for the Germans. And every Roman soldier has that and knows how to use it. So you are much more heavily equipped, which is good in many ways, but has other problems in certain circumstances. So head-on encounter in an open field, the Romans are going to smash the Germans. But that's, of course, why Varus is forced by Arminius not to be able to fight that way.
That's a perfect summary. Thank you so much, Adrian. And one thing we should mention, looking at the map, Chris, I mean, as you can see, this terrain is a long way from Rome in every possible way. It is shrouded in woodland. There's swamps as well. Talk to us a bit about how kind of the terrain innately favours the German tribes.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying the Romans are quite used to this terrain. They've been campaigning for quite some time, from the time of Drusus. And one thing that's significant is during the campaign between 11 and 9 BC, the Romans strike the Cherusci. And at that time, Arminius is captured as a 10-year-old. And during that campaign, Drusus is nearly caught in the same way that Varus is caught here. So one can actually think there's some memory here from Arminius saying, I remember when I was captured, when the Romans were here before, Drusus was nearly trapped very much the same way. And it's only the Romans' ability to get into their familiar formation that actually gets them out of that. In fact, Drusus forces the troops to actually get into formation, but they jolly nearly suffer the same sort of disaster. So he's seen this before. This is not something that Arminius has just cooked up. He said, you know, I remember when I was a 10-year-old and I got captured, this is something worth doing. So what we've got is a situation here. We mentioned earlier that the angry Varii have been set up as the bait, if you like, and they're the ones that are misbehaving in Varus's mind. And Arminius keeps leading the Romans on, saying a little bit further, a little bit further. And obviously, he's getting messages from the other German tribes saying we're almost in position here. And what he's trying to do is get the Roman army to go through this defile between a fairly high hill here called the Kalkriese, as you can see, and an extensive bog here. Now, there's only about 100 to 200 meters between these two features. And in fact, the Romans think they're going to go this way, but the night before, they're conscious of the fact that the Cherusci auxiliaries with Arminius have suddenly disappeared, taking a quarter of basically their auxiliaries and their scouting element with them. So you think, right, we're in trouble here, something's going on, and what we're going to do is we're going to do a night march. But before we do that, we're going to build a camp. And they build a really good camp. They're quite well fortified. And their experience in Gaul says if you actually stick there, the tribes won't be able to hang around long enough because their logistics won't stretch it. And there's numerous examples in Caesar's Gallic War where legions have held out. But it relies on you having a field force to come and relieve you. There is no field force. The other two legions are already in winter quarters. So they go, well, we're not going to be able to hang out here. So they say, we're going to continue through the territory of the Angrivarii, and you can see the route they intend to take. The problem is there is a huge downpour overnight, absolutely torrential rain, which saturates this complete area, which is already fairly boggy and marshy here. So you can imagine a lot of slipping going on. This is not a made-up road. So you're going through territory that is not great for foot soldiers, especially heavy infantry. So you've got a real problem here. Now, meanwhile, the Germans have massed on the high ground on the flank. Adrian's already mentioned how stretched out they are. The column is probably about 9 kilometers long. So they're thin and they're long. The Bructerii, one of the German tribes, is starting to attack the rear. So they're forcing the Romans onwards even more. And what the Germans have done is they've built a trench alongside the path here. So it's very difficult for the Romans even to get at the Germans. On top of that, they've built some embankments, earthen embankments. So the Germans are behind fortifications, essentially. And once the attacks start all along this line here, the Romans try to attack the Germans on the earthen embankment. And of course, it fails because they're well dug in. And the key point is, I think that the Germans are ready. They know what they're going to do. The Romans can't concentrate because of the marshy, boggy land here. And the Germans are on the higher ground. I mean, it's a perfect situation. They're blocked in, and it's a running fight all the way along here.
Well, Adrian, why don't you pick up the story and talk us through the events of the battle itself, which takes place over 3 days?
Yes, at the very least. It's this... Varus has been off stamping out rebellion, as he thinks, and he's on his way home, but starts to realise that things aren't right. And as Chris has just said, this is not great terrain, particularly because you're late in the season and as the weather turns. These aren't properly metalled roads. You know, the Romans are famous for their roads they build throughout the empire. And while they help trade and all this sort of thing, the first thing they do is help the army and the army's supplies move around. But you're in terrain that simply does not have that. You're stretched out. You're overburdened with, as I say, all the civilians, all the traders, all the people who've been selling things to you or selling things and trading with the Germans. You've got the troops' families. Now, famously, we know that Roman soldiers aren't allowed to marry and have families legally, but that regulation comes in at some point under Augustus, and we don't know when. and you assume that anybody who already had a family was not, forced to get rid of them. But we also know that later on, Roman soldiers have relationships, have someone they consider to be a wife and raise children. So you've got all these people who shouldn't really be with a field army are there, and they're people you care about. Now, Varus, fairly early on, once he starts to scent trouble, has a lot of the baggage wagons gathered together and burned and kit abandoned. Now, that's obviously a sign of desperation, but it is the sort of thing that Roman armies have done before. And in situations, Chris was talking about Drusus and the tight spot he got into, they can get out of this. But at first, it's a series of nibbling attacks. Again, the point Chris made very well. Because of the terrain and because you're following a track, you've still got there's some equipment you can't get rid of. There are some wheeled vehicles you need to keep. You've got mule train, you've got a lot of equipment, and you've got to have the food that you're going to eat in the weeks that it's going to take you to get back to the Rhine. So you're still carrying a lot, even if you've hopefully got rid of the luxuries. Although, again, they found in the excavations there, someone was carrying, presumably a senior officer, a rather nice couch with ivory decorations to the legs and this sort of thing. So there's still a lot of stuff that really shouldn't be there is burdening down this column. The Germans start to attack wherever they see a weakness. In a long, thin column, you can't be strong everywhere. Now, the Romans do have proper drills for moving in dangerous territory, restricted territory, where you have, a vanguard, rear guard, you have people on the flank, you have scouts. But of course, once Arminius and the Cherusci and other Germans disappear, your best scouts, your reliable local auxiliaries have gone. And your guides as well, everybody who's telling you which way to go. So apart from being disturbing, that also means you're more likely to make mistakes and you don't know that maybe there's an easier route around things. So you have hit and run attacks. The Germans are not going to stay and slug it out once the Romans can form a fighting line and the legionaries can start to get themselves organized. But they can go in, hit where the Romans are vulnerable, do some damage, run away again. Perhaps take some captives or just kill. This starts to nibble away at your strength. So over the course of a couple of days, you are starting to suffer, and it's deeply dispiriting because it's like any situation where someone can hit you, but you can't hit back. You can't stop this from happening. Now, Varus gets wounded early on. We don't know how badly, but he then despairs and kills himself. Or often you've got a slave or someone to help you do this. Now, we famously think of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Brutus and Cassius end up killing themselves in the last act. Lots of famous Romans, Mark Antony will do the same thing. But it's the sort of thing you do when you're fighting a civil war against other Romans. Then it's acceptable for an aristocrat to prove his virtue by saying, well, I will never give in to some Roman I hate. You're not supposed to do this when you're fighting foreigners. Instead, a Roman commander is supposed to keep fighting, and if there's a disaster, you rally whatever survives, and you prepare to fight again the next day and the next day. You never, ever give in. It's one of the reasons the Romans win wars against Hannibal, why they conquer this empire, is because they don't quit. That's the aristocratic ideal. But when your commander kills himself, and his senior officers arrange a little cremation, and, so they can carry his ashes away, this is deeply dispiriting. So there's a problem at the top of the Roman army early on. But somebody, more junior officers, staff officers, perhaps the legates, the commander of each legion, the tribunes who are their sort of senior staff, and then the centurions that are officers sort of, by modern equivalent, you're dealing with something that varies between, say, a captain to a lieutenant colonel or even full colonel. They are professional officers, not the sergeant major types they're often portrayed as.
Absolutely.
Some of them get together and decide, we are going to break through this. We can still get out, because Roman armies have fought their way through these sorts of problems before. And as Chris said, they try to organize this night attack. They move to wrong foot the Germans, surprise them in the hope that these are non-professionals. They're not going to be keeping too good a watch. Maybe we can make progress and break through. But again, because of the weather, this constant rain that has turned what was already fairly boggy soil into real marsh, means that it's difficult for a man on foot or on horseback to struggle through. It's incredibly difficult to get a vehicle through. And remember, you've still got some of the women, the children, the weaker ones. You've got the wounded that you've suffered in the engagement so far. You're trying to get them through. That channels you more to the left and forces you, famously, they found in the excavation a skeleton of a mule that had on its collar a bell. and the inside of the bell had been packed with long grass to stop the bell from ringing. So they try to sort of muffle things, to creep through, get as far as they can, but they can't. They are just channeled by this ground. They're stuck on one side by the ditch and rampart the Germans have made, which is straight out of the Roman army's playbook.
Yeah.
You know, this is where Arminius has looked at the sort of marching camps, field fortifications the Romans can throw up at the drop of a hat, and thought, well, we can do that, and it's going to work for us. So they push forward, they try to fight, but it's breaking down. And you've had this, there is a lack of central leadership. The man who should be in charge has despaired and killed himself, and nobody quite knows who's in charge anymore. The cavalry commander tries to go off on a different route with his horsemen and break out on his own. They'll eventually get isolated and wiped out. There are probably others who are deciding we're going to be better off in a small group or as an individual and are leaving. But you've got some determined people who push through, fight their way through. Part of the rampart is pushed over. One of the mules even gets across the rampart and seems to then fall in and break its neck, and is buried in when the rest of the thing is collapsed afterwards in the aftermath of the battle. They push on, but they're getting weaker and weaker. There's no real momentum or force behind this attack. When you break through an ambush like this, you're supposed to have not just an organized fighting line, but reserves ready to move to wherever you see a gap. You put them in, you exploit it, or to reinforce points where things are going badly. But of course, you've got the problem of lack of space, but you've also got the problem of lack of clear leadership to make this happen. So although you get so far, the Germans, of course, have only grown more confident as day has passed day, and they keep on fighting the vaunted Roman army and winning. And they see these men not being so fearful as they thought. So eventually, on the map where there's that square, that's probably about as far as any organized body of Romans get. That's where the last stand is. 5 years later, a Roman army under the son of Drusus, a chap called Germanicus, arrives to bury what remains of the comrades that had fallen here at the Teutoburg Forest. And they talk about the difference where you have these clusters of skeletal remains where a group had stayed together, fought together, but finally been brought down. Other places where people had run. And, it's an army that is falling apart. There are a few people who are still trying to do their job and just not quitting until the very last, but there's not enough of them, and they're not sufficiently organized. And the position by this time is so bad, they've been forced to go this one route that's just where Arminius wants them to be, that in the end they die as individuals or in small groups, but there is no way out. Some surrender, and their prospects aren't too great either. But the army falls apart and the army dies. And it's that last day where this is completed.
Adrian, that's a brilliant overview. Thank you so much. Chris, to bring you in on that, anything you want to add? And one thing we should mention is what you can see here, this red line, is some of the Romans trying to escape to the north, but then, of course, they encounter the German swamp.
Yeah, absolutely. Some actually escape. There are records of some of the Romans actually making it back to the Rhine, either in small groups. Some are enslaved. A great many are sacrificed. One of the things that Adrian will know as well is quite a lot of the Romans were sacrificed in the Germanic way. There are skulls nailed to trees. It's pretty barbaric from a Roman point of view. And of course, the Romans think this has to be avenged at some stage. And we get to a situation much later. Arminius starts to threaten the Rhine frontier. And in fact, the two legionary commanders do really well in actually holding the line of the Rhine. And Arminius and the tribes are held at arm's length. And it's not until Tiberius comes to the throne in AD 14, and he had been in command actually in Germany just before this revolt, before the Illyrian revolt had occurred. They actually want to get revenge for this, and I think it's worth mentioning that Germanicus, who is Tiberius's stepson, Drusus's son, actually is then given huge resources to take revenge. And in the space of a campaign between 14 AD and 16 AD, there are a series of armed raids, serious forces going into Germany to avenge this defeat and try and stabilize the situation. And what is really interesting is they make it to the Elbe, which is the river that runs roughly from the Jutland Peninsula down towards the south. And that is always the sort of frontier that the Romans have in their mind they might get to and they might actually have. But what happens is that Arminius's wife and son are captured. as part of that. They're sent to Rome. Adrian mentioned earlier Flavus, who's Arminius's brother. Flavus in Latin means blondie, so quite extraordinary, really. He's a German, but he stays loyal. And Germanicus not only puts huge forces in about 5 different campaigns. He heavily defeats both Arminius and the other Germans who were confederated with him, but they withdraw again. They go back. They don't complete. Why is that? Because Tiberius starts to think Germanicus is getting very powerful here. He's almost like the Roman gladiator figure. If he gets too powerful, I might feel threatened. So he gets withdrawn. And in fact, the Roman historians say, one last push could have done that for us. But he is withdrawn, and it carries on. But Flavus stays loyal. Now, later on, in near 41 AD and up to 50, there's another series of Roman campaigns that occur, and they really try to finish the job. They find the final legionary eagle, which is held by a tribe called the Chatii. Germanicus had recovered 2 of the eagles from the legions at that time, and in 41 AD they actually discover enslaved survivors of the army as well, who they free and bring back, obviously, wow, to civilization again. So the Germans continue to be interested in doing these very big armed raids. Now, the key lesson from all of this is rather like when you're invading Russia, you don't go in penny packets. You have to go in force. Remember, we talked about Saturninus and Lepidus in 6 AD went in with a huge force to sort out the Marcomanni. Whenever you go into Germany, you have to go in with a big force, and it has to be well supplied. The lesson of the Varus campaign is if you go in penny packets, the sheer demographics will overwhelm you if they're well coordinated and commanded.
Well, there we go. That's the real history of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, this is what we love doing on History Undone. We're going to ask ourselves now, how could the battle have played out differently? And if it had, what the long-term consequences might have been. Just before we do that, Adrian, I wanted to bring you in on kind of, the familial links at play here. Because, Varus is not just a Roman governor. He's actually connected to the emperor. I mean, he is tied to Augustus, is he not, through familial links?
Yeah, and it's not just he's tied to the emperor. Augustus, we've got to remember, is the first emperor. There's been Julius Caesar, who's been dictator for a while, but whereas we get used to the idea of the Roman Empire and we expect there to be an emperor at the top, Augustus is the man who actually creates this one-man rule, military dictatorship by any other name. And because of that, he wants to avoid the civil wars that have brought down the Republic, led by people like Caesar or Pompey, who've been the great conquerors, who've gone out and carved out territory to add to the empire of the Roman Republic. So Augustus is very careful as his reign goes on to make sure that any major war is led by someone closely associated with him, so that the glory ultimately comes back to him, which means the problem is, of course, the ignominy of any disaster is also associated with him, which explains the fact why all these campaigns are very much a family affair. We've already talked about Drusus, the stepson of Augustus. He and his brother Tiberius, who will eventually succeed Augustus as the second emperor, they are used as some of his major generals in the campaigns as soon as they're old enough. They're given responsibilities and commands far younger than would be normal within the Roman political system, because they're people the emperor feels he can rely upon. And they both prove to be pretty talented commanders as well. So it's Drusus who conquers most of this stretch of Germany in the first place. And then it's Tiberius who will help to stabilize the frontier after the Varan disaster. It's Germanicus, the son of Drusus, nephew of Tiberius, eventually adopted son of Tiberius, who will go on to fight these wars of punishment. And even when you extend it, Publius Quintilius Varus doesn't sound that important, not really known about. But the reason he's got this job, but also earlier jobs, is because he's married into the close associates. First of all, he marries the daughter of Augustus's main henchman, Agrippa, and then he marries Claudia Pulchra, a great niece. And so he's part of the extended family. Augustus won't trust any other senator to go off and get a big command, because that man might get ideas and might think, well, I could be emperor as well.
But is that not a mistake, Adrian? So sorry to butt in. Is that not a mistake? Because, of course, you know, Varus does not get a particularly good write-up in history when it comes to being a military commander. And some would say if you had a more effective commander here, you wouldn't have had this disaster. So does that nepotism come back to bite him?
It does. I mean, Varus he's been sent to Syria before, and he had a reputation as quite a good lawyer. But as far as we know, he'd never actually fought a battle before he got to Germany. So it's possible that he had, but we don't know of it. And, you know, he's not described too favorably for his governorship of Syria. It's said that he went to a rich province as a poor man and came back from a poor province as a very rich man. You know, so there are question marks about him. Now, obviously, after the disaster, everybody's going to set out to rubbish the man. But the problem is, yes, Augustus has trusted someone on the basis of personal loyalty more than talent. Now, the problem is always with relying on talent is you have to be good at recognizing it. But in the ancient world, you tend to be suspicious that the more talented they are, the more ambitious they're going to be. So you have this problem. And of course, famously, there are these stories of when the news of the Varan disaster gets to Augustus. 3 legions have gone, 3 out of 28. So more than a tenth of your legionary strength of the entire empire has gone in just a couple of days in Germany. And Augustus is supposed to be in despair, wander the palace at night, banging his head against the walls or the doorways, and, you know, yelling out, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions, or where are my legions, depending on the variation. It has. The only thing I'd say to remember, though, in this context is this is not a war the Romans wanted at all.
Yes.
The empire has become rather overstretched. The big war has been Pannonia Illyricum. That's where all your talent has gone. This is very much second 11 stuff, and you're just hoping there won't be a big problem here. Unfortunately, there is, and the man on the spot is not someone capable of dealing with it.
Well, Chris, let's bring you in on that. I mean, first big fundamental question about how the battle could have played out differently is, did it need to happen in the first place? Should Varus not have listened, for example, to Segestes and thought, hang on, I'm walking into a trap here?
I think Adrian's explained how the Romans were lulled into a true sense of security. There are all sorts of signals coming from one side saying, look, you can trust these guys. Arminius is one of us. You know, the Romans are very good at turning people. As a diplomat, and I would say that Varus's skills are as a diplomat. I mean, he settles Judea after the death of Herod the Great, for example. He does the same in Africa. In some ways, it doesn't matter that he's a poor or inexperienced commander, because he's got good military commanders underneath him. He's got 3 legates, he's got the heads of the legions, and as Adrian says, you've got a whole rank structure amongst the centurions. I mean, you know, the primus pilus, the first spear of the first cohort of any legion, is the equivalent of a brigadier. We have to think of it in that sense. In many people, as Adrian hinted, think that centurions are NCOs. Well, the ones who are commanding centuries in the 10th cohort, yes, they're NCOs, but by the time they get to first spear, you know, they're senior officers. So there's a lot of military talent here. Now, the historians say, well, actually, Varus didn't listen to some of the military advice. And quite a lot of people were saying, look, don't go via the Angri Varii. They're not worth it. Go straight to winter quarters now. It's late in the season, and you should go straight there. And I detect the fact that the cavalry commander, first sign of trouble, he's off. It's not as if he starts fighting, he goes. And I detect that actually people are saying, this is not a great idea. And you get this sense amongst the Roman historians that Varus is not leading an army that is going the same way on the same day, well, even though physically they are.
And that's an interesting point. And to put to you, Adrian, once he goes into the Teutoburg Forest and realises that, you know, he's got these tribes attacking him. Now, I suppose to begin with, he thinks these are the rebelling tribes that Arminius has warned him about. It may take him a while to cotton on to the fact that Arminius has turned on him. But should he not have had the foresight, maybe, you know, on the first day, to think, hang on a minute, this isn't good, we need to retreat?
Retreat is difficult because if you go back further east, then you're further away from the Rhineland, and you've got to find a way back. We don't know. It's always difficult to tell how much good information they've got about the terrain and routes that would be suitable for his army that he could take, that could take him around here, and how far back you have to go. probably that's his best bet, because the Germans are not an army that can stay in the field for too long together. They'll have to go home to get their own food. So if you don't engage but withdraw, he can probably last longer than them. But again, he's got to accept the fact that he's wrong and that he's misread the situation. He's misread Arminius, and people often don't want to believe this. They keep hoping, oh no, if I keep with the plan, it'll be all right.
Cognitive dissonance.
Sort it out.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance. It's classic military failing. Yeah, absolutely.
And again, remember, he's got these experienced officers with him, but again, it comes back to this idea, they're not the pick of the bunch. This has not been the priority. The really ambitious people have tried to get a posting in Illyricum, because that's where the attention of Tiberius has been in command a lot of the time. You know, you're going to get more rewards. A third of the Roman army serves in that campaign. So it's a little bit like, say, Malaya in 1941, early 42 in the Second World War. It's not the best part of the British and Indian army that is there to defend this, because all the very ready units and the ablest commanders have been sent elsewhere where they're needed immediately, rather than somewhere where we might have a problem, but in a few years' time, and hopefully we can react. It's the assumption of many governments is that you'll have plenty of time and warning for when a problem does start to arrive, that you can actually commit the resources to that area. And he doesn't have that. So again, there's lots of mistakes have been made before he got there, but what he could have tried to do was organize more tightly, be more ruthless in terms of getting rid of baggage, and try to fight through in the way that Roman armies have done in the past.
Chris, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think part of the problem, Adrian, is they spent the summer amongst the Cherusci, and they've probably got a bit soft as well. And instead of building fortifications, doing all the things, civil engineering projects that the Romans do, they know they're going back to winter quarters. So they've probably got a bit slack too. They're not very fit in terms of actually battle fitness. I think the secret here is, if you realise once Arminius has gone, you stay in your camp and you wait for the German tribes to be able to melt away because they can't manage the logistics. Why on earth they thought it was worth going on is beyond me. There is a thing that occurs with armies in particular called press-onitis. Everything will be all right as long as we keep moving, we keep press on. And I suspect this has happened here. The fact that this is a sideshow makes you even more isolated. So commanders make strange decisions when they're isolated and they don't think they're going to be relieved. And we know that the nearest help is on the Rhine. It's only a couple of legions that are already in winter quarters. So essentially, they're not formed up for any expeditionary warfare in Germany. So they're not coming to help you. And so you're very isolated. In those circumstances, commanders do make very strange decisions. And as I said, do something. The soldiers need to be led. They need to be motivated. So we'll carry on marching. We can handle this. And of course, Varus doesn't remember what's happened under Drusus, and none of the legions involved here were involved in Drusus's campaigns in Germany.
And just very briefly, Chris, before we come on to the long-term consequences of the battle, obviously we can see that they end up kind of here. The remaining Roman
Some of them
forces.
do.
Some of them do, and then they get captured and executed, etc. Not many. Could they have pushed on? Could any of them pushed on along the intended path?
Well, we don't know what state they were in at this stage. The archaeology and the records don't actually tell us. The fact of life is that if you're strung out in a long march like this and can't get into the familiar sort of formation, the testudo is the classic one where you lock shields, and you've seen that at the start of the Gladiator film. If you can't do that, you've still got the same problem if you're going down here. What you get away from, of course, is the trench and the fortification system that is here, and the Germans then have to come out into the open to get at you. But I suspect by the time that they got to here, they've been so thinned out and their formations have been broken up so much that simply if you'd gone down there, you'd have been taken out in detail rather than in strength. I can't see that you survive. This is a killing ground. It's absolutely been set up as a dead-end killing ground. And as I said earlier, it's how you actually put deer or other game that you're chasing into a place where you can kill them.
OK, let's zoom out now and let's ask ourselves what the long-term consequences might have been had the Battle of Teutoburg Forest played out differently. OK, you can see in front of us now we have our big map of the empire as it was after the expansion during Augustus's reign. Adrian, to begin with you, if the Battle of Teutoburg Forest either doesn't happen or somehow Varus is able to quash the Germanic tribes there, do you end up with the empire expanding into Germania Magna? Or actually, you know, does that not happen? Because the status quo probably worked for the Romans anyway. They had these kind of pacified tribes who they thought were on their side.
Well, it's certainly presented that Varus and others actually think that Germany between the Rhine and the Elbe is turning into a viable province. You know, the process has happened in so many other places that people start to accept that, yeah, it's good being part of the Roman system. As the aristocracy, we get benefits, as the career of Arminius has demonstrated. You become rich, you become famous, you have opportunities throughout the world. So it's quite possible that you could have ended up with a Roman Empire that went that much further east rather than ending on the Rhine, where it will stay. And you know, the Romans themselves are clearly unsure about this. 100 years later, Tacitus will write in the Germania that, you know, it's taking so long for our victory over the Germans to materialize. There's still some of them that are thinking that this is an ongoing war. On the other hand, you know, there are big changes that are going on. Augustus has probably expanded too fast and worn the empire out. The resources to do this maybe aren't there. The Emperor Tiberius, who becomes emperor in AD 14, is an old man by this time and doesn't want to go off on campaign anymore. And unlike Augustus, he doesn't have a lot of family members like himself, like his brother Drusus, like Germanicus, Gaius and Lucius, all these others. He doesn't have relatives he can trust to go off and fight his wars for him. Partly because a lot of them have died in mysterious circumstances or been arrested and executed by him, which does mean there's a limit on future expansion. But I think there's no reason to believe the Romans couldn't have conquered and occupied this area permanently. In most provinces, you get a rebellion about a generation after initial conquest. So Boudicca's rebellion in Britain, it's 17 years after the invasion. Round about that time, you've got young warriors who've grown up, who aren't so frightened of the Romans, think they can try and push them out. This rebellion under Arminius is probably that rebellion in this area. If you'd actually defeated it, then there is a chance that everyone would say, yeah, okay, fair enough. You know, there's advantages to being Roman. It's a less developed area economically, agriculturally than, say, Gaul, but it's not impossible. Whether that would make any difference in the long term is another matter, because does it just mean you've got another river frontier just further to the east facing another load of barbarians with different tribal names, but essentially the same sort of people that will cause you problems over the centuries and eventually in the collapse of the Western Empire? So I think it could have happened. But again, you know, there's lots of other factors coming in as well.
Well, Chris, let's bring you in on that. Let's say you end up with Germania Magna becoming a Roman province and it goes up to the Elbe. You've then, as Adrian intimates, you've then got other kind of tribes, you know, in Eastern Europe to deal with. Yeah,
if you look at the records, there are a couple of things going on this frontier after the Teutoburg revolt. One is the sense that actually we need to keep these armies occupied because they might actually cause trouble. So we've got to keep them building stuff. We've got to keep doing these raids into Germany. And the other issue is it actually worth it? This is a very undeveloped area. You don't have the communications that occur along the Rhine here. As Adrian said earlier, you know, it's essentially farming, herding communities. And the tax take is not going to be that great. And is it worth actually having another active frontier on the Elbe, for example? Will the economic justification actually keep you there? I think it's doubtful, to tell you the truth. And what the Romans do, of course, they extend into the Low Countries. Under Germanicus, they put their fleet in to do the massive raids that they undertake to stabilise the situation. But there's this constant tension between keeping these armies occupied, which is why you go in there. So in some ways, it serves a useful function. You know, if the armies are getting a bit restive, you go and give the Germans a good hiding, and it gives your armies something to do. And then, of course, in the 40s, the attention is focused on...
Well, so if they had pushed east into Germany Magna, would they have then gone for Britain?
Well, I mean, Adrian knows a lot about this, but the fact of life is Britain was always this sort of holy grail that Roman generals and emperors wanted to get hold of. Quite apart from the resources, it was the idea it was on the end of the world. You know, it was in the ocean. And you see under Caligula, the emperor before Claudius, he actually masses his legions on the beach and then decides probably it's a bit too risky. He remembers what happened to Julius Caesar, and he gets the soldiers to collect shells to demonstrate his domination of the ocean. And they collect huge numbers of shells on the beach, and they decide it's not really worth it. So the Roman equivalent of Operation Sea Lion, you know, completely sort of repeats itself. There is a sense that actually they had stabilised the frontier by the time of the 40s, and the 4 legions that actually take part in the invasion of Britain come from this particular sector. So they've stabilised their frontier. They think, OK, Britain for prestige, and also we think there might be gold there and other things, slaves and things like that. We'll go to Britain instead. And in fact, I think the British expedition then takes over, if you like, as their active frontier while they develop the Rhine provinces, and Germania Inferior and Superior essentially become part of the Gallic social economic system.
Adrian, I'm fascinated to get your thoughts on that. Is there a scenario in which if the Romans push east, they don't end up going for Britain?
Well, it's interesting, and it illustrates Chris's point very well. The author Strabo, who's writing in the early years of Tiberius's reign, talks about Britain and says that, well, you know, there's all this stuff there and it's quite appealing, but the cost of garrisoning it would be more than any profits you could make, so therefore it's not worth taking. So the Romans are thinking in exactly those terms. And Tacitus, the son-in-law of the governor of Britain, Agricola, late in the 1st century, he tells the story of an Irish prince coming to Agricola in Britain saying, you know, will you back me by force, appoint me to reinstate me in my tribe. I've been thrown out in Ireland. And Agricola says, well, I could do it with a legion and auxiliaries, but again, the revenue would not justify that level of expenditure. So they do think in this, you know, cost-benefit way, quite clearly. With Britain, as Chris also says, that there is this mystique about it. It's Claudius, as emperor, who's the man who sends the invasion in 43, is the son of the heroic Drusus, the brother of the heroic Germanicus. But, you know, think back to Derek Jacobi in I, Claudius and the Graves' novel. He's lame, he's drooling, he's considered to be an idiot. He has no military reputation whatsoever. And he needs something. He needs some military glory. You know, it's why he bothers to travel. He comes to Britain for about 10 days before clearing off. But he's got to be there in at the kill to take the credit. He builds an arch. You know, he names his son Britannicus, for goodness sake. It's all this emphasis. So he needed a spectacular triumph. And in some ways, although the Romans weren't quite sure how big Britain was at this stage and whether it was another sort of semi-continent until Agricola sails around the top of what becomes Scotland and discovers, no, it's an island, they might have thought this was more self-contained. The links, Britain is, again, it's a little bit like Augustus going into Germany because, again, as Chris said at the start, Caesar has been there. So Caesar's been to Britain. He's shown them that, you know, it's reachable, but it's still mysterious. So I think Britain was always likely, and Britain does prove eventually to be fairly prosperous, but it requires a disproportionate garrison for a long time. For much of the period, there's 4 legions and auxiliaries go to conquer it. For most of the remaining Roman period, there's 3 legions and auxiliaries. It has one of the largest armies in the empire is concentrated in Britain. Look at something like Hadrian's Wall, all the troops and effort you have to put up there. There are clearly military problems in Britain. But on the other hand, if you look at the 4th century AD and later on, the prosperity of the villas, of the agricultural economy in Britain becomes something that clearly does benefit the empire generally. So I think Britain would always have been tempting. On the other hand, as they went further east, again, judging from the archaeology, there's not a lot that's really wealthy the further east you go. So you're getting back to Chris's point of diminishing returns the more you do. There's probably more in Britain that's worth it. But even then, you know, it takes a long time before the Romans decide, and Augustus and Tiberius don't go there. Even though in each case, leaders from Britain cross the Channel, get into Gaul, appeal to the Roman emperor for support. And, you know, there's clearly Roman money going there and Roman political and diplomatic influence from early on, since Caesar. So there's involvement, and that level of involvement always had the potential to lead to war and invasion. It's just that so much comes down to what's the empire doing when the opportunity arises? Is the emperor interested? Has he got other problems? Does he need glory? There's lots of those human elements, the chance that can affect whether one of these big wars actually happens.
Chris, do you have a final thought on the impact on the Roman Empire before I bring in a really long-term potential impact?
No, I think the point we made about overextension is really important. I mean, this is a huge empire that, if you like, its only real means of communications are the Roman roads.
Yeah.
And that gives you what you would call in modern warfare a network-enabled capability. You can actually put these troops anywhere you like, but this is a huge distance. And even today, this would cause problems if you were, as we know from the Second World War, the distances and the mass that you have to take and support is huge here. I mean, the Romans keep nagging away at Germany. I mean, famously in the film Gladiator, of course, Marcus Aurelius goes in to sort out the Marcomanni again, who seem to be the sort of bête noire tribe in this area. So you see that. And later in 235, an emperor called Maximinus Thrax, he gets involved. But Commodus, the emperor, says exactly the point we've been making. It's not worth it. I know about employing the troops and keeping them, absolutely in the front line, but actually the cost-benefit analysis just does not justify it. And after that, the Romans say, fine, we're going to settle down on the Rhine frontier and we'll try and defend that, because we're starting to see some real pressure coming from the east.
OK, here's my really long-term consequence, potentially, of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Arminius becomes, certainly towards the back end of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, a hugely important figure for German nationalism.
Yeah.
And it informs some of the narratives around the Franco-Prussian War and indeed in the rise of Nazism. So what do you think the legacy of Arminius is as a result of this battle? Starting with you, Chris.
OK, well, we've got to remember that Arminius fell out with his confederates and was poisoned in 21 AD, didn't like him very much. Oddly enough, his own tribe, the Cherusci, said to his brother's son, Italicus, who was a Romanized, totally Roman, Flavus, his father, Blondi, had gone through the Roman system. They said, look, can you come back and be our king, please? That didn't happen. But the fact of life is that you end up in a situation, as you say, where Arminius, who is known as Hermann the German, of course, has this huge statue erected, much to the south, of course. It's not anywhere near the battlefield site. Hermann Denkmal, it's called, and I think it's something like 82 feet high. It's the Nelson's column, if you like, of Germany, and of course it faces France.
Yes.
So although obviously everybody says it faces the Roman provinces, it's actually facing France. There's no question about that, and it becomes the symbol, as you say, of German nationalism. All sorts of operas and novels are written around it, and he becomes the symbol of this defiant, freedom-loving Germany that is sort of described in Tacitus' Germania, but is promoted throughout the 19th century as being the absolute symbol of German manhood and German aggressive military power.
Adrian, bring you in on that. I mean, how important is this battle for fostering a sense of German nationalism that will then kind of ricochet through the ages?
It's seen as sort of confirmation, the things like Tacitus Germania we've already mentioned. That's rediscovered in the early modern period and helps to inspire the German nationalism that is seen in the Reformation, as well as the political aspect of that development. And Martin Luther is one of the people pushing this. Oh yes, Arminius, modern it would be Hermann. That's that idea. So, and people are defining themselves because the Greco-Roman tradition has influenced Western culture to such an extent. The Germans can say, well, we can take all the good bits from that, but we were so tough the Romans could never conquer us. So that makes us special, that makes us different. When you're looking for some link, some reason to combine all these separate states into a Germany, then it's useful. But bear in mind, Napoleon III is doing the same thing with Vercingetorix and the Gauls who fought Caesar. He's putting all this money into excavations at Alesia. You've got the jokes that come through into the Asterix books, that tradition of the Gauls as our ancestors. That still, I don't know if it is still now, but certainly friends of my age who went to school in France talk about that as normal in the textbooks. So people rediscovered. It's different in Britain because, of course, you have the whole Anglo-Saxon thing, which is late Roman, post-Roman for English identity.
But King Arthur.
But in
King Arthur.
Yeah. Again, so elements, you're drawing on all of this to fit yourselves in. It's a little bit like when Julius Caesar arrives in Gaul in 58 BC, the main tribe he allies with, the Aedui, claim to be descendants of Trojan refugees, which is why they are the kindred, the brothers of the Romans. Yeah. And probably everybody knows this is complete nonsense on every respect, but diplomatically, it's a nice little convenient thing to say, oh, well, yes, we'll be friends then. So people invent their identity, or they take the past and they adapt it. So, this is the big victory. But on the other hand, there's also, 406 and the tribes going across the frozen Rhine. There are other aspects. It's also that not just did we defy the Romans, but we, the Germans, brought down the Roman Empire, despite the embarrassing fact that the Franks who did that then became the French, that, of course, you're building this big statue to confront. So, like a lot of these things, you take what you like and what's convenient.
Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. There's
even the argument that one of the appeals for the Ardennes offensive in 44, the whole idea of Wacht am Rhein is that Hitler has this nostalgic, well, in the forests, we're going to do better. Yeah. Because look how we beat the Romans. Because the Nazis had developed, it's there. I mean, so you have these odd themes will come through. And it's, it seems crazy to outsiders, but presumably it's logical to the people who are thinking this.
Chris, super briefly.
Okay, so, I mean, the obvious thing is, if the Romans had gone up to the Elbe, would it have affected things later when the barbarians obviously invaded the Western Roman Empire? Not a bit. The fact of life is there is huge pressure from the tribes to the east. And as soon as the Huns start coming to the west and pushing all these other tribes, not only into Gaul and Germania, Superia, Inferior, also into the Balkans and all these other provinces, you've got this tidal wave of barbarians, some who are trying to get into the empire to enjoy the benefits of the empire, others who are saying, well, actually, there's actually rich pickings here. But as soon as the Huns start pushing everybody else in, it's all over. Because the demographics just dictate how that goes. So it doesn't make any difference whether you go to the Elbe, as I've seen some people say.
Well, gents, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you both so much for your time. I think we can say that the Battle of Teutoburg Forest definitely deserves its status as one of the most consequential battles in history. Had it never happened, what could have been the impact on the Western Roman Empire? Would it have expanded into Germania Magna? Well, maybe it would have done, probably never going further than the Elbe, because as Chris just very eloquently outlined, you would still have the threat of the Huns to the east. But also then, what would that mean potentially for the invasion of Britain? Would that then go ahead in 43 AD? Probably yes, but it might make it slightly different in terms of the circumstances around it. And crucially, what about the long-term impact on Germany as a nation and the idea of German nationalism that sprung from Arminius' victory in Teutoburg Forest, the way that his legacy was then pounced upon by the Prussians in the latter part of the 19th century, but also by the Nazis in the 20th century. Some really big long-term consequences, all stemming from the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me, and we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History on YouTube. And if you like this, why not subscribe to Times Radio's main channel, where you can catch me presenting Frontline, our interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye.